And the guy worshipped those stones. Interesting shaila, because technically it's part of the mountain, but not really, because it's no longer attached to the mountain. Perhaps it's considered a separate entity. It's like any other item or object, which is considered avodah zarah material with all its ramifications. There's a machlokes between Bnei, the sons of Rabbi Chia, whose names were Chizkiah and Yehuda, as opposed to Rabbi Yochanan, who disagreed with them. Now, we're not sure exactly who said what. One said it's okay, one said it's not. Chad Amar, one maintained asuros, those stones are forbidden. They're deemed avodah zarah material. Chad Amar mutaris, the other one disagreed, he said they're okay. They're part of the mountain, which remains unaffected. My time at the Manda Amar mutaris. How would you explain the opinion that they're okay? Kahar, they're comparable to the actual mountain, where they came from. Mahar, just like the mountain itself, is immune to this type of activity. Why? Because the mountain has no element of human intervention. It's not man-made, right? Mahar she'emoy tfisasi de'adam. There's no element of human involvement. Therefore, it remains resilient to this type of activity. Umutar, as we learned yesterday. Afani, likewise, these stones. She'emoy and tfisas de'adam. They weren't man-made items. Umutar, hence, they remain unaffected. Well, how could you compare the detached stones to the attached mountain? Malahar, perhaps the mountain is different. Shkem mechuber, still attached, as opposed to the stones which have been detached. Maybe they are susceptible. Well, we could undo that distinction by taking a look at an animal, a behemoth. Techiach, that will disprove this distinction, right? Because, as we know, if one worships, bows to an animal, so although the animal cannot be used for a carbon, it's called ne'evad, but that's because there are higher standards with respect to carbon suitability. Which means to say that for mundane personal use, the animal is fine, despite it being a detached item. Likewise, these detached stones. Well, malabahim, how could you prove from an animal? Shegem balas chaim, it has its own advantage, its own redeeming factor. It's a living being. That's why perhaps it's unaffected by my activity with the animal, as opposed to a detached stone which doesn't have that quality. Well, har yechiach. Let's go over to the third peg of this equation, the mountain. The mountain itself disproves this suggestion, because the mountain itself is not a balachai, it's not a living being, and remains resilient to this type of activity. We're going to go back and forth between all three. Basically, how can we determine what is the defining factor? The element found in one is not found in the other, so you can't attribute it to that element. For instance, the animal is a balchai, but the mountain doesn't have that, and it's still resilient. Oh, the animal is attached. Well, you can't say that's the reason, because the balchai is not attached and still immune. The element found here is not found there, so you can't attribute it to those reasons. So you have to find something common to both. So what's the common denominator between mountain and animal? They're not man-made items. They don't contain an element of human interaction, of human, doing. Therefore, they remain unaffected by this avodah zarah activity. Likewise, other items, like those boulders on the mountain, there's no element of human doing there. Perhaps they should also be considered immune to this type of activity. Well, but let's take a look at another common factor found by mountain and animal. They're different than the detached boulders, because mountain and animal have never taken on a new form. They're pristine. They're still in their original form. So since they're presenting as a totally natural phenomenon, they're unaffected by avodah zarah, as opposed to those stones which have come apart, come loose. They went through a transformation of some sort. Perhaps they are no longer considered pristine natural phenomena and could be impacted by avodah zarah. Okay, we'll address that by doing a slight tweak, slight shift. We're going to form a joint source by combining an animal, but not a pristine animal, an unblemished, unchanged. No, behemoth balas mum, a blemished animal, which had undergone some element of transformation. It was a shinoi, right? It's no longer in its original format. Umehar, and join it together with a mountain. So we'll take the balmum animal together with mountain, and now we'll draw a common denominator and say, look, they're both natural items, naturally occurring phenomena. So just like they're unaffected by Avodah Zarah, likewise these detached stones. Well, you'll argue and you'll say, animal is a living being. Of course it's resilient. Well, the mountain is not a living being, it's still resilient. Well, the mountain is attached. Well, the animal is not. Well, the animal is unchanged, as opposed to the stones off the mountain. Well, the animal is a balas mum. Remember, it's a balas mum. Of course it was changed. Still, it remains immune. Likewise, our item. Vinami, alternatively, you can have another sort of joint source, behema, tama, umilon yavish. Pair together a pristine, unblemished animal, which was worshipped. Join it together with a tree that died, that dried up on you, and then was worshipped. And both we say that they remain unaffected by Avodah Zarah activity. Likewise, our loose stones. Well, you say the tree is mechuber lekarka, it's attached. Well, not so the animal. Well, the animal is in its pristine form, unaffected, unchanged from the original, as opposed to our stones. Well, go to the tree, which just turned dry, totally transformed, and still it's unaffected. So you join together these two items to provide that sort of common denominator. Source, that anything natural is unaffected by Avodah Zarah. Likewise, these stones on the mountain, which were not man-made items. So that explains the lenient approach to consider these stones resilient, unimpacted by Avodah Zarah activity. Uman da Asr, the opposing view, who says these stones are affected. I understand you can find sources, but that's exactly what the Torah emphasizes and re-emphasizes. Distance yourself. Consider it despicable. Tie it to Saven over and over again. To preempt any attempt at mitigating the severity of Avodah Zarah materials. The Avak of the Asya Medina later, even if you discovered a channel, a possible source to permit these stones, loy tas, you should not go down that route. You shouldn't draw out and produce a heter. Okay, so bottom line is, a mountain itself, unaffected. An animal, unaffected. Stones that came loose, machlik. Chizkiah, the sons of Reb Chia, who permitted it. How do I know? The boy Chizkiah, one of those individuals, had an interesting question that could perhaps shed light on his position regarding the stones. Zakav beitza l'shtach b'slo. Mao. For he took an egg, he stood it upright. Right? He positioned it upright with the intent of bowing to it. Mao, what is the status of that stone? Now, Kasanka Daitak, we figured at this point in our conversation, he planned on bowing, and he did bow. So what's the question? The question is, an egg is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It wasn't man-made. But Haiski Fasa, the fact that he lifted it upright, that he changed his position, the question is that a considerable a masa? Is that considered a sort of a change? Do we view it as impacted by human activity? Ihave masa, iloyhava masa. Do we now consider there to be, human intervention or not? Right? The fact that he changed his position, is that sufficient to make it susceptible to Avodah Zarah? But apparently, if not for the fact that he placed it in this position, it would not be affected. It wouldn't become asr. Why? Because by its very essence, an egg is a natural thing, not man-made. And this is despite the fact that it's not attached to the ground. So it's like those detached stones on the mountains. Shemamna, perhaps we can conclude from here that in fact it was Bnei Reb Chia. Those are the ones who said the Sharu permitted those stones, just like this egg, which would be permitted, were it not for his meddling with the stone, with the egg. Lo, no, perhaps I can tell you Bnei Reb Chia, the Asri, it was actually Bnei Reb Chia who banned those stones. If and if in fact he bowed to this egg, even without changing his position, even without tinkering with it, it would be asur, because it's not comparable to a mountain. A mountain is attached to the ground. This is not. This is given to human to be used by humans. It's meant to serve humans. It's a different thing than a mountain. So how do we explain this question regarding the egg? What's he asking? If it's always asur. Here we're speaking about a unique case. True. He placed it upright with the intent of bowing to it, but he didn't carry it out. He didn't bow to it. So that's his question. Hold it. What kind of question is that? Laman. Again, whose opinion found elsewhere are we speaking about? Are we following? Are we going like the opinion that holds that an idol established by a Yid is asur right away, even before worshiping it? This is a discussion later on in the Masechta. We'll see Bez Hashem. So, according to that, Shita, asura, this egg is certainly asur immediately. No question. Even prior to worship. Well, according to the other Shita, that you have to wait until it's worship. So again, halei palcha, in this case, prior to bowing, there was no worship. So what's the shaila? Of course it's permissible. Of course the item is mutter. It must be speaking like this. A unique case. The Yid placed his egg upright with the plan, with the intent of serving, of bowing, of worshipping. But he didn't get around to it. And what happened? And a guy came around and bowed to it. And this question is actually very similar to the following scenario depicted by Rabbi Damar Shmuel. He deals with a similar case. So again, a Yisrael took his brick, stood it upright, with the intention of bowing to it. And before he got around to it, a guy came along and bowed. So he carried out the Yisrael's plan. What happens to that brick? Asura. It is considered forbidden material because it was worshipped. Again, because the Yisrael was Megala Das, indicated that he was agreeable to having this thing worshipped. It was a standing invitation, right? By standing up the brick, he was sort of inviting worshippers. Okay, so he was Megala Das, and therefore it's considered Avodah Zarah. So that's by the brick. Likewise, in our case of the egg, you can argue likewise that the Yisrael's act serves as a standing invitation, and likewise it should become asur by the guy bowing to it. So the question was like this. So he asked, "Levenu the minkur skifasa." Perhaps you can say there's a difference when you stand a brick upright. Minkur skifasa, you can tell the difference. You can tell it's standing. It's a pronounced act. That's called a clear indication of intent. Aval beit, so by an egg, it's a small, insignificant item. Perhaps it doesn't have that same pronouncement, and therefore it doesn't have the same halacha. Or perhaps you don't differentiate. Whatever act he did to indicate plan, intention, for ishtachavoya, for avodah zarah, that makes it susceptible to the guy's activity, and therefore it becomes asur. Take it, we leave it unresolved. Okay, so let's just recap quickly. We had a shaila regarding the mountain itself. If it was worshipped, it's still mutter, but the stones which came off the mountain, which came detached, which came loose, that was a machlokes. Shall we say it's like the mountain itself and remains unaffected? Shall we say it's different? We had a machlokes on that. And then we had an interesting machlokes regarding an egg that was repositioned and the guy came and bowed to it, shall we say it's like a brick that's asur or not? Boy, Rami Barcham. Now comes a new question posed by Rami Barcham. So bowing to a mountain doesn't impact the mountain with respect to personal mundane use. What about if you want to use the mountain material for Beis HaMikdash purposes? Certainly has higher standards, right? Just like by the Baal Chai, a living being, a living animal. You bow to it, you can still use it for personal use, but you cannot bring it as a carbon. It's called ne'evad. Something which was worshipped is disqualified from hakrava. So a similar question regarding a mountain. If one bows to a mountain, avanav, so it's stones. Can you take stones and construction material, ma'ul mizbeach, and use it for the mizbeach and the Beis HaMikdash? Shall we say yesh ne'evad? It is considered disqualified and put into the category of ne'evad, something worshipped, which is not suitable for karban. B'mechuber eitel gavaya. So perhaps this applies even to something which had been part of the ground, like a mountain. Is possible with respect to gavaya to Beis HaMikdash use. Oy ein ne'evad b'mechuber eitel gavaya. Perhaps you can say that no, something which is connected to the ground, it's mechuber l'karka, never earns a title, the title of ne'evad, even with respect to higher use to Beis HaMikdash use. Now, in Tzalema, if you're going to say that yesh ne'evad b'mechuber etzel gavaya, you'll take the more strict approach that even mechuber is considered ne'evad and is disqualified for Beis HaMikdash use. Perhaps here it would be different, because it's only machshirei karban. It's only being used to facilitate karbanos. It's not actually a karban. It's being used to build a mizbeach on which you bring karbanos. Shall we say machshir karban ki karban are treated on the same level as the actual karban ki karban damu, in which case they're pasul for mizbeach use, or perhaps not. So perhaps you can take stones off the mountain to build a mizbeach. I want to conclude that it's asr. I'll prove to you that it's asr. Huma esnan. Take a look at the esnan item. That's the gift given to the immoral woman, right? Shemutar betalish lehedyot. If the gift entails an object, right, an item, that is fully permissible for an ordinary person to use. There's no isser to use that item afterwards. Still asr b'mechubel gavaya. But with respect to Beis HaMikdash use, right, like a carbon or whatever, you can't use it for the Beis HaMikdash. Even if you gave her mechuber, she got a house as a gift. How do I know? The pasuk says lo yisavi esnan zoyna mechir keleb, and the pasuk continues Beis Hashem. You can't use an esnan, even if it's a Beis Hashem. If it's a building, you can't use it for the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so you can't donate that house to the Beis HaMikdash to be used for, whatever. So we sort of see that there are two extreme sides of this spectrum. On the one hand, the esnan, with respect to an ordinary person's use, is fully mutter, even if it was a detached item given to her. Still, when it comes to Beis HaMikdash, we have way higher standards. Even if it was something attached to the ground given to her, it's us. Loish no tolish, loish no mevachuv, right? Certainly a nevad, an item that was worshipped. Nevad, it was worshipped. Sha'asa b'tolish, lehedyot. In that case, if it was a tolish, an ordinary item, it now becomes asr and off limits even for an ordinary person. You can't even take it for mundane use, for personal use. So it has that strictness. Certainly, wouldn't you think? Eino din, of course, it would lend to reason that with respect to using it in the Beis HaMikdash, sha'asr would be totally forbidden, b'mechuber, even if it was something attached to the ground, l'gavaya to the Beis HaMikdash. Right? So if we find that esnan, which on the one hand is very easy, still for gavaya, it's very strict. Nevad, which is strict even with respect to personal, mundane use, certainly we should be overly strict when it comes to Beis HaMikdash. Even something mechuber that was worshipped like a mountain cannot be used. So that was Rav. Amali Rav Huna B'Rav Yeshua. The Rav Yeshua responded to him, you know what, you can actually reverse the whole train of thought and produce a totally different conclusion and permit the mountain stones for the Beis HaMikdash. Go the other way around. It all depends on the starting point of this discussion, of this Kal V'Chomer. Instead of starting with Esnan and moving on to Nevad, start with Nevad, the item that was worshipped. Ma Nevad. Since we find by a Nevad, She'asa b'tolosh etzel hedid. If it's a tolosh item, it's an ordinary, object, and it was worshipped, it cannot be used by even a hedyot, even a regular person. Still mutar mechubel gavaya. But if it's something attached to the ground like a mountain, it is permissible, even for Beis HaMikdash. Let's assume so. Shenamar, the pasuk says, only the statues, not the mountains. Elihem alaharim, right? But the mountains itself are not considered their gods. And we assume, whether you try and take it for personal use, or you're donating it, it's mutar. So certainly an esnan item given to the Zayna, shemuta v'hatalish lehedit, which is fully permissible for ordinary person to use, even if it's an ordinary item given to her. So we have that leniency. Certainly, and it wouldn't it lend to reason shemuta mechubel gavoy, that if it's something mechubar, sure, if it's an animal or something detached, you can use it for the Beis HaMikdash. But if it's something mechubar attached to the ground, perhaps it's unaffected by this gift giving, and it's mutar for the Beis HaMikdash use. Well, what about that pasuk that you quoted, Beis Hashem Lekecha, which seems to indicate that even a structure is forbidden for Beis HaMikdash use if it was given to her in this context? That's needed for a totally different halacha. It's not coming to teach anything about this. Because the Sanya for the Brisa, Beis Hashem Lekecha, it is limiting to us the scope of the Esnan Isser. It only affects karbanos, right? Things which are offerings. Prat lepara she'ene bala lebayis, as opposed to paraduma, right? The paraduma, even if it's an esnan, it can use it because it's never delivered to the Beis HaMikdash. It's sort of processed outside the Beis HaMikdash. The akrab and all that takes place on the Har HaZeisim. So it's not covered by this isra. It doesn't have to, conform to these guidelines. The Rabbi said, Rikuim, they learn Beis Hashem Lekecha a little bit differently. It's actually a stringency that even the Rikuim, the gold plating of the walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, cannot be made using esnan material. But the bottom line is, according to this approach, which is Rav Huna B'Rav Yeshua, instead of producing a strictness, produce a leniency. So back to the question. He worshipped a mountain. The mountain itself is still permissible. It's mutar, it's unaffected. What about taking material and using it for the Beis HaMikdash? Rava says, based on his Kal V'Chomer, it's Asr, whereas Rav Huna B'Rav Yeshua retweaked the Kal V'Chomer and produced a leniency and was matter. Amalei, so Rava responded, that's a rule. When faced with a double option, two ways of presenting Kal V'Chomer, you meant to take the strict approach. That's the rule. I proposed a strict Kal V'Chomer. V'at amras l'kul, and you're presenting a Kal V'Chomer which with a lenient outcome. And the rule is kula v'chumra. When faced with two options, leniency or strictness, l'chumra parchina, and we present the Kal V'Chomer in a strict way. Papa responded to Rava, is that true? Whenever faced with the multiple option, a Kal V'Chomer that produces chumra or kula, what are we meant to do? We're not meant to use the one that produces the kula, really? Here's an example. V'azor de Pesach. This is a discussion back in Mesachas Pesachim. A fellow became tamei, touched the mace. They need to apply the paraduma waters on him. So happens to be the seventh day when he needs the water. It's Erev Pesach, when he brings the korban Pesach, but it's Shabbos. On a Shabbos, you're not meant to do this. There's Isma de Rabbanon to sprinkle the waters because it's Mesakin. It looks like you're fixing him. You're turning him from somebody who's tamei, making him tar. So it's a shvus. Withhold. The Rabbanon meant to stay put, not do it. But his korban Pesach is on the line. What do we do? So there was a machlekes. V'hazor the Pesach, the pligi, there was a machlekes between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Lezer holds l'chumra. He has a Kal V'Chomer there, and the Mishnah over there that just like you can do the shechita of the Pesach, even though it's a real malachim and Torah, certainly you can sprinkle the waters. So l'chumra, he produces an obligation, a strictness. This fellow has to proceed, go through the process and bring the korban Pesach. Right? Become a chayv of the gaver. According to Rabbi Lezer's strict Kal V'chomer, this fellow is now obliged to get himself ready for the Korban Pesach. Whereas Rebbe Akiva, his opponent Lakula, he actually goes the other way. He produces a Kal V'chomer, which produces a leniency and exempts this person from the sprinkling the waters in the Korban Pesach. Upater exempts him. Because Parach, Rebbe Akiva Lakula, and clearly Rebbe Akiva presents a Kal V'chomer, and which produces a leniency, despite having the option of going the other way and producing Kal V'chomer, which produces a strictness. This non, we have the Mishnah, Heishav, Rebbe Akiva responds to Rebbe Lezer, Echila, perhaps reverse the Kal V'chomer and say it like this: Uma haza'ashi mishum shvus. If even sprinkling the waters is also midrabanan, eino docha Shabbos, is not meant to override Shabbos. Right? Typically, we don't do it on Shabbos. Shchita shim, right? It's certainly the shchita the Korban Pesach, which is a malacha and a Torah. It's one of the 39 malachas. Like Koshkan, of course, you can't do it. Okay, and they went back and forth. But in any case, evidently, even when faced with a double option, we can pick the lenient route. Well, says the Gemara, actually, Rebbe Akiva wasn't really basing his opinion on this Kal V'chomer. It was just a mode of bringing out his a way of expressing his opinion. Because even he knew that you can do shchita of Korban Pesach on Shabbos. There's a pasuk for it. So all he was trying to say is that, you Rebbe Lezer once taught me that Hazah is asur on Shabbos, even in this type of context, even at the expense of his Korban Pesach. So it wasn't really based on Kal V'chomer, so really it's not relevant to our discussion. Hasam over there in that story, Rebbe Lezer, Gamri, actually taught Rebbe Akiva, had taught him in the past that it's forbidden. V'yakar le Talmuda. It so happens that he forgot this fact. V'as Rebbe Akiva lat kuri. Rebbe Akiva was simply trying to remind him, and he was doing it in this gentle way, and he was sort of presenting it as part of the equation of their back and forth. And that explains why Rebbe Akiva how he responded to Rebbe Lezer. He says, "Rabbi, my Rebbe, al tachpereni b'shas hadin. Please don't deny during our discussion." Meaning, you yourself. Kach mekubel ani mimcha. I heard this from you. I learned this from you yourself. That hazah, applying the waters of the paraduma, is a shvus. It's forbidden midrabanan. Ve'enu dechel Shabbos. You can't do it on Shabbos. So there goes our reference. We thought it had to do with how to present a Kal V'chomer. Really, Rebbe Akiva's leniency, it was unrelated to a Kal V'chomer. It was actually a fact that was taught him by Rebbe Lezer, that this fellow will not be available for the paraduma since it's Shabbos, even though it's at the expense of the Korban Pesach. Okay, so again we had this discussion, this question posed by Rami Bar Chama. One vows to a mountain. The mountain itself is exempt from any consequences in terms of mundane use. What about for heavenly use? For instance, using the stones to construct a mizbeach. According to Rav, it would be asur. According to Rav Huna Rishua, it's okay. Here comes question number 2 posed by Rami Bar Chama. A similar question. By Rami Bar Chama. If one bows to standing grain, to wheat that's standing, it's already grown. He bows to it thinking this is going to be his way of currying favor with the power of wheat, to give him sustenance, to provide him with his bounty. Okay? That's what he's thinking. So he's bowing to it. The wheat certainly remains unaffected because it's mechuber l'karka. Question is, can I use it as a mincha? Can I take the kernels, turn it into flour, process it for mincha, carbon mincha material for the Beis HaMikdash, malo menachos? So what's the question? So this question is really linked to the previous question, meaning, assuming that there is a concept of nevad b'mechubar eitzel gavoya, meaning worshipping a naturally occurring phenomenon which is still attached to the ground, such as the mountain, such as the wheat, although it remains unaffected for personal use, for mundane purposes, but it is labeled a nevad. It's considered a worshipped item and disqualifies it for higher, Beis HaMikdash use. Assuming that's the case. But here perhaps it's different. You know why? Because you're not using the actual original material for the mincha. Nobody brings kernels into the Beis HaMikdash. You process it into flour. So perhaps that shinoi, that transformation, allows it to sort of let go of its problematic label. It loses its nevad status because it's no longer the original item. It takes on a new form. Perhaps it's okay to be used in the base. I mean, yesh shinu, shall we say, this shinu, this process, this change that it went through, benevad can benefit even a worshipped item and make it permissible. Or ain't shinu benevad, perhaps shinu will not benefit this item. Let me try to prove this from halacha. So we have kol asur l'gavei mizbeach, all forbidden animals. Let's say an animal which was worshipped, nevad, or there was revia done to it, there was interaction with a human, so they become unfit for carbon use. What about their offspring? The animal has a baby. Well, the same return, their offspring are acceptable for mizbeach use. So that's the shita of the chachamim. But Taniela, we have a brisa which adds another opinion onto this. Rabbi Lezer Oyster says you can't use it. And then what is assuming? This machlokes connects to our discussion. The question is whether Shina, you see, this unborn, animal was now born, right? So it went through that transformation, that change. So perhaps, although initially it was affected by the mother animal and attained the same status, which made it possible for mizbeach, but now it took on a new form, a new shape. It's a born animal, independent of the mother. That would be the reason for the chachamim permitting the animal for mizbeach use. Whereas Rabbi Lezer says, Shinoi, still the same material, just because it presents differently, it remains us. There you go. So our question is really resolved because it's a machlekes. No, unrelated, says the one. Haven't we ever explained that the correct approach to understanding that machlekes is as follows? It's unrelated to the question of shinoi. No. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Ravua, machlekes. That whole discussion, meaning the reason why the Rabbanan permit the offspring for mizbeach use is speaking kishenirbu. So the animal was violated, and then it became impregnated with this offspring. So the question is like this. Sure, the mother animal serves as one cause element in creating this offspring, but there's a father animal as well. So it's called zeh v'zeh germ. You have two causation effects. Two germim bringing about this result. Can I just ignore one and reckon with the other? Can I ignore the mother animal, which is usher, and just reckon with the father animal and consider this offspring to be kosher for mizbeach use? That's the Tanakama, that's the Chacham. Rabbi Lezer says, no, zev is a germ is usher. As long as there's one problematic element involved in generating this result, in this case the mother animal, that's sufficient to disqualify the child. That's all. That's the machlekes. Nothing to do with shinoi, right? Aval ibru l'b'seif nirbu. In fact, if the animal had already been mu'beres, carrying this offspring within it, and then it was violated while carrying this offspring, Dibra kol asur, all would agree that's asur, because the animal itself, the unborn animal, which is now born, had taken part in this experience, this sinful experience that the mother experienced. Despite the fact that now it's a born child, a new entity, it looks different, it presents different, it doesn't matter. Because ultimately it's the same material. The same story with us. He bowed to the wheat, turned it into flour. It certainly would be usher. It's like the second case here, where it was violated and then, it was in existence, Ibru, the fetus was there, in this case the wheat was there, and then it was violated, and then it was bound to, in the case of the wheat. So turning it into flour wouldn't be serve as any saving grace. Some had a slightly different version of this back and forth. So again, the question was, wheat that was worshipped and then turned into flour, is it fit for service? We attempted to prove from the story of the animal, and that was presented by Mar Zutra, Breder of Nachman. So actually, he didn't just present the machlekes and allow us to counter it. He himself continued. He said, look this. Here's the machlekes regarding the offspring of this forbidden animal. And you should know, V'itmar la. Actually, we have this explanation provided on that brayso. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Arvoa, Machlekes kishenirbu, ulbasayf ibru. Yeah, that whole discussion only pertains to where it was violated and then it became impregnated. Then we have a shita which says it's okay because the uber was generated by the mother, which is asur, and also by the father, which is mutter. So we have a question of whether we have to reckon with the problematic element or not. In the case where the animal was already carrying the offspring within it, and then it was violated, so the animal inside took part in that experience. All agree it's asur, even after it's born, and it presents differently because we don't care. It's the same material. Likewise, in the case of the wheat, it maintains its forbidden status. So the case of the wheat is comparable to this last scenario where it existed and then was violated. So although it undergoes some sort of change afterwards, in this case turned into flour, it doesn't matter, it's asur. Well, how can you compare one to the other? There's good reason to believe that although in the case of the animal, the offspring remains asur and doesn't lose its earlier status, but wheat turned into flour, perhaps it's an entirely new entity, entirely new form. How could you compare? Hasam. There, mikara behema, vashta behema. The newborn was a behema even before being born. It was an animal, it's now an animal. It simply was locked in there. A dasha, the doorway, so to speak, who the achiza, or the achida, ba'anpa, was locked before it, so it couldn't get out. So of course, we don't view it as a new entity. But hacha, over here by the wheat, turned flour, initially it was wheat. It was one type of item. Now it's flour. This wasn't worshipped. It presents differently as a new form. So perhaps it's not mo'os, it doesn't have that status. It's no longer despicable, it's not something which would be disqualified for mizbeach use. Okay, let's do a quick chazara. We started with the mountains, which are unaffected by avodah zarah. However, the worshipper himself gets punished full force because he himself did an act of avodah zarah. What about the stones that came loose? Machlekes. What about the brick picked up by the yid for avodah zarah purposes? It becomes asur even if a guy came along and worshipped it. By the egg, we're not sure. The first of Rabbi Bar Chama's questions was, what about the stones off that mountain? Can we use it for the Beis HaMikdash, for the Mizbeach? So Rabbi says no. Rav Huna Rishua says yes. The second question was, even if we say that it's considered asur for Mizbeach, it's called Yesh Nevat Gavaya, but if there's a shinoi, if it's reprocessed like the wheat turned into flour, another interesting question which was left unresolved. All the best to you and Hatzlacha, Rabbi.
Okay. A thought that comes from Sota 35a. It says the ark bears its bearer. Have you guys heard this before? I don't think the impact as to what that means really registers until you begin to look at the dimensions and the weight and the size of the ark. Now, for all of you burgeoning mathematicians, can pull out your calculator and start calculating as I count off some of these figures. But there's a lesson to be learned from bringing this stuff into perspective. Now, the Torah describes the measurements and the construction of the ark in great detail, and the pertinent data is discussed and explained further in the Talmud. For example, in Baba Batra 14a, the external measurements of the ark were 2.5 cubits long. Now, a cubit and a half and a cubit and a half wide and a cubit and a half high. Now, we need to find out what a cubit is. Exodus 25:10 is this reference. And keeping with the Talmudic computations, that 1 cubit equals 6 handbreadths. Well, how in the world do we know what 6 handbreadths are? It's roughly 3 to 4 inches. Depends on the hand, I guess. If you're a big monster guy, then it's 5 inches, I guess. But 3 to 4 inches. So if you're writing that down. So that would mean that, could you shut this office door for me, please, somebody? The length of the ark would have to have been 15 handbreadths long. So that would be what? 15 times 4 inches, right? And its width 9 and its height 9 handbreadths. Now the Torah continues to describe the ark's construction, saying overlay it with pure gold. As a matter of fact, if someone would like to pass this book around, there are several pages that show the picture of the ark. Let me show this to those who are watching. This book is probably one of the best illustrated books. It comes from Mizora Publishing Ltd. Art Scroll Series on the Mishkan. Fantastic book. If you would like to buy it, it would be worth to have in your library. Now, the sages conclude that the ark was constructed from 3 arks within one. There's a good diagram inside of it. These 3 arks, in fact, were crates, as the ark had no legs. The ark stood on the ground, and its opening was from the top. One ark was made of acacia wood, with something like cedar wood, like a very nice smelling, very hard wood too. And there are depths of spiritual meaning that goes into all these things. We won't go into it tonight, but I want to get some of the statistics out. The innermost and the other 2 were the innermost and the external. So you have the acacia wood, then you have the inner box inside of that, and then the outside that was gold, and the inside was gold. They were made of gold. The width of the wooden walls, according to the calculation, was 1.5 hands breadth. So that would be roughly 5-6 inches. In handbreadth. The golden arcs were very thin. In fact, no more than thin internal and external covering. It's a very thin covering around it. Now we can then computate the internal measurements of the ark as follows. 14 hands breadth in length. You writing this down, Sandy? She's going to test all my math later. I'm scared. You scared me, okay? 14 hand breadths in length. 8 in width, 8 in height. In addition, there were thin strips of gold, 1/2 hand breadth in width, which covered the edges of the top of the ark on 4 sides in order to give the ark an appearance of being made entirely of gold. It gave it this very, very solid thing. Sure, if you'd like to show the picture, it'd be fantastic. No, just to the guys. The other ark, there were gold, on the outer part of the ark were gold rings on the 4 corners, 1/3 of the way from the bottom. And to these, and there's a picture of the rings themselves and how they attach. In these were placed the poles using carrying the ark. Inside the ark were, according to the sages, the first tablets of the 10 Commandments, broken by Moshe upon the descent from Mount Sinai. The second tablets and the scroll of the Torah, the Sefer Torah, written by Moses before his death in the wilderness of Moab. If you would like to refer that to Exodus 25:21 and Deuteronomy 10:1 through 5, or 10:1 through 5. Maimonides, in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, said Moshe wrote the entire Torah in his own hands before his death, and he gave the Sefer Torah, each one to the tribal elders, and placed one in the ark for posterity. In addition, there were deposited in the ark the flowering staff of Aaron's rod and a bowl or jar of manna. The measurements of the tablets were, according to rabbinical tradition, 6 handbreadths in length, 6 in width, 3 handbreadths in thickness. Now, Baba Batra 14b, it says Moses placed the broken tablets in the ark as if they were whole. He set them in the ark together. The tablets then took up 12 handbreadths, which were about 40 inches, 48 inches tall, a little bit higher than this desk. 12 handbreadths in width, which is about 48 inches in width, about the same size. 6 in width and 6 in height, leaving 2 handbreadths in the length and width of the ark, basically 24 by 24, 24 inches by 24 inches. The measurements of the Sefer Torah written by Moses according to the same Talmudic tradition were 6 handbreadths in width and 2 in thickness, 24 by 8. So if you're putting this thing together, these are the preferred measurements of the Sefer Torah. The diameter being 1/3 of the height, Moses placed the Sefer Torah in the core of the ark. There was enough empty space, 6 inch by 2 inch by 6 handbreadths by 2 handbreadths by 2, which is 24 inches by 8 by 8. Does that make sense? This is the space that was left, and this space was big enough to put the Sefer Torah. What do you give me that look? Did I miss something? Messing up? So 24 inches by 8 inches by 8 inches, okay? Now, I'm going somewhere with this. Now, according to the measurements of the ark specified above, its weight must have been between 150 and 200 kilograms, about 440 pounds, just the ark itself. Now, we still have to add the weight of the acacia wood. We have to weigh the solid seraphims that were on top, gold seraphims, which were about 48 inches tall, 40 inches tall. So we start looking at the weight. On the weight of the ark, we have a reference here in the Sefer Parshiot, and it says that the tablets weighed, according to rabbinical tradition, the description above, about 40 seah each, which is equivalent to approximately 500 liters, or 1,105 pounds. Now we're getting somewhere. So you have 440 pounds. Now you have over 1,000 pounds. If we translate the volume into weight, we're speaking about approximately 500 kilograms of stone being heavier than water, so that they cause each pair of tablets to weigh about 1,000 kilograms, which would then bring the weight up to what? Over 4,000 pounds. You realize this is 2 tons. By the time you put the gold, the acacia wood, the tablets of stone, the Sefer Torah, and then we're not counting the curtain that goes over top of it, was 15 hand breadths of a cubic meter. The cherubims were 1,500ths of a cubic meter. The volume was not hollow, since the cherubims were solid gold. The weight was about 10 handbreadths, or 40 inches height. 40 inches tall. So I have no idea how much gold that is. Do you have any idea how much gold each angel would be? Solid gold, 40 inches high. So what are we thinking, estimate, possibly the ark with its contents and its poles and its curtain would possibly weigh? Because here we have to estimate. We don't have a specific number. Would it be safe to say over 6,000 pounds, maybe 5,000? Can 4 men carry that on their shoulders? No possible way. The above description of the ark and the measurements and contents of the ark raises several questions. How could these 4 men actually carry the ark? How in the world would poles not snap immediately being picked up? I don't know if you've seen, but these bodybuilders that do deadlifts and presses, they'll have 500 pounds on them, and this huge steel bar is bending. It's incredible. So, and it wasn't a steel bar. It was wood with gold. Moreover, how was it possible to even not only lift it, but how are they going to walk with this thing? It could have not been done by natural means, of course, and this being apparent, the reason behind the Talmudic saying that we said in the beginning that says, the ark bore its bearers. Sota 35a. This is also explained why God became angry at Uzziah when he reached out to try to steady the ark. Why did he become angry? It was because the ark was capable of supporting itself. It didn't need anyone's help. And that's why there was such judgment that came to him. says the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, Uzziah, it bore its bearers, and it can certainly carry itself, meaning it does not need your assistance. According to the sages, then it was an optical illusion that the four men were carrying this. Because in reality, the ark bore its bearers. Now, it is in my opinion that the sentence expresses more than the physical meaning behind itself. It means the Torah actually upholds those who uphold it. The lesson that we learn from this is that as our pursuit to obtain knowledge from the Torah and even the minute details of measurements and seem to be mind-numbing information and possibly not very germane to your life today, understand that by studying this text, you are bearing up the Torah, but in reality, the Torah bears us up. And where we study Torah and we get engaged in listening to hours of lectures, which are available all on the internet and YouTube, etc., you don't understand how much support it's giving your spiritual being, how much it strengthens you. It says that if you have a headache, what do? Study Torah. If you have a stomachache, what do? You study Torah. Now, it's being said that the Torah is what helps to support us. We're not supporting the Torah. As a matter of fact, one of the most beautiful things about those who have come out of other religious traditions to Judaism as B'nai Noach or convert or ger is they realize that the Torah doesn't need defense. You don't need to apologetically present the Torah in some defensive manner to prove anything. All you have to do is state what it is because the Torah is able to support itself. See, that's the whole beauty of the whole thing. And as a matter of fact, when we look at the larger scale of the temple, what do we see? We see the three levels of the temple sort of corresponding to the three sort of spheres of human existence. You have the outer world, which is our world of physicality. You have the inner world, which is the inside of our body, the thought processes, the emotional process, the spiritual process, and then the inner court is the divine essence or spark that's within all of us. And with that being said, the ark in the Mishkan was for what purpose? He says, build me a Mishkan so that he may dwell. What does that mean? Can all of God dwell in the Mishkan? Well, no, that's ludicrous, right? It was not a place for God to corporately dwell within a sphere because it is impossible for God to do this. What did it mean? It was an anthropomorphic term to say that by building the ark, you will have a physical sign of our intimacy and our relationship with each other. And what does the Ark of the Covenant represent in the Holy of Holies? It represents the very mercy seat of the Creator of the universe. Not that the Creator of the universe could possibly sit there because he has no physicality. What it means is the Creator of the universe has this beautiful piece of furniture that represents something that represents the heavenly, which means it is a central point of focus for every Jew and the high priest to say that God Almighty rests here. That is why that even in the Second Temple era, the ark did not have a place in the temple. Why? Because the presence of Hashem was not there. Now, it doesn't mean the presence of Hashem wasn't there. It's just that the Jewish people lacked a level of intimacy because of what was going on in the priesthood. There's a whole great study that I posted on Facebook, Nativ page today. I think it was Jeremy Gimple and Ari Brimowitz that did the thing on the book of Ezra. Did you listen to it? You have to listen to it. It's almost a play-by-play of what's been going on in the state of Israel for 78 years. Almost a play-by-play. We're in the final throes of redemption, and it is important for us to understand that there are more non-Jews coming to Torah Judaism, either by being a righteous non-Jew or conversion, than ever in history. As a matter of fact, this same phenomenon took place during the time of Ezra when they came out of captivity back into Jerusalem. Only 70, 100 and something thousand people came out of Babylon. Many of the Rabbanim stayed in Babylon. It was interesting. It was a lot of the lesser qualified Kohanim that came out. As a matter of fact, they were their pedigree was so unsure as whether they could actually serve in the temple. This is what caused the problem in the rebuilding of that second temple. With that all being said, there is something to us appreciating this great love that we have for Torah. And when I've heard today that Art Scroll's greatest audience and the most the biggest customer was the Goyim. Did you know that? They sell more books to non-Jews than Jews. Something is going on in the world that we live. Why? Because the Torah is the elixir of life. It is the very thing that carries you. It is not a burden. There are no weights in the Torah. The laws that comes and the measurements that are required of the Jewish people and also the non-Jewish world are not too heavy for us because it carries us. And I say this in conclusion. There's a lot of debate in the world of the non-Jew and the Jew. And that I had a rabbi from Crown Heights ask me just the other day, what part of the Torah do you study? And I said, we study all parts of the Torah because that Torah is also the nation's Torah. And he goes, that's because that's the Jewish people's responsibility. It's their Torah. I said, well, let me explain. I said, how does a non-Jew know what its place is without a Torah? Doesn't know. Where do we get the rules that we are to live by without a Torah? We have to have that same Torah. And I was explaining that there are some rabbinical traditions that are taught that without the oral Torah, we wouldn't know what we were to do. As a matter of fact, the things that we are not required to do are mitzvahs if we don't do them. Does that make sense? I know it's hard for people to comprehend. For example, I'm sitting at a non-Jew is sitting at a Shabbat meal. There's a bottle of wine. Can a non-Jew touch the Kiddush wine? No. He can't pass it. Okay, now somebody can pour it, but he can't touch it. How would you know that if you don't know the Torah? If you don't know the oral Torah? So the very law that says that you shouldn't touch it, the rabbinical law that's prohibition of touching the Kiddush wine, applies to the non-Jew just like the Jew has laws for the Kiddush wine that applies to them. Does that make sense? So the whole point is it's the same Torah. It's for us all. The Torah bears up the world. As a matter of fact, I would take it another step further. We understand the Torah, the study of Torah and prayer is what supports creation and continues to allow creation to continue on. If there was no study of Torah, if there was no prayer, creation would cease to exist. So Baruch Hashem, we have this beautiful Torah. We have the opportunity to study. We have new people coming in all the time. Our YouTube channel just hit the high point, and it hasn't dropped down at 190,000 minutes watched every 28 days. Incredible. We've just slowly climbed up. So with God's help, through His loving kindness, may you be borne up by the power of Torah. Amen.
God's favorite subject, the Matrix. Let's talk. Let's ask questions. Feel free to, for those who saw the movie, for those who didn't.
Lift up my eyes to see the day of plowshares from our souls. A time to mend, a time to gather stones, a time for peace in Israel. Let me hear the voice of bride and groom, a of laughter in the streets. Answer the prayers of our children, so we need not fear in Israel.
Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 76, Romans chapter 15, with Rabbi Michael Skovak from Canada. Welcome back. I was going to say something that rhymed with welcome back, but I couldn't think of anything.
Welcome back, Skovak. How's that?
How could it be so simple and I just overlooked that? I deserve that one. Oh, man. The first thought that came to my mind when I said welcome back was welcome back Cotter, but that was not going to play out. So,
a lot of youngins that won't know what you're talking about.
Right. So I'm just expressing my age. Okay, I get it. Oh man, what a great day! It's been fun. It's been confusing.
Hashem, that's great.
Yeah, it's been very confusing for me though, because apparently I missed. I forgot about a couple shows that were already canceled. I was thinking we were going to go air live, and it's like okay, and I was like calling like Rabbi Kaufman. I was calling him, and I was like, he's not answering. What's going on? Then I remembered. It happened to me and you one time. Remember, maybe a couple times. I don't know. I just forget who cancels and who doesn't. And then this morning I had delayed it a little bit because I had a little bit of a headache. And then by the time we got ready to go live, Rabbi Singer wasn't feeling good, so that one was out. So this is the first show for today. So I've had the full day to go in and out of the studio, putting up 2x4s and insulation and stuff. So it's been keeping me busy. So no complaints.
That's like found money.
Come again?
That's like found money when you have all this time that you weren't expecting to have.
Yeah. Very true. Very, very cool. Well, I tell you what, it's definitely good to be back. Hello, Lori. Welcome back to the show again. I'm trying to get I've got on-screen chat as a new feature I'm trying to put on. It doesn't do much good for the people watching live, but the ones who come back, which are the majority, they can actually watch the video and actually see the comments that were going on during the actual live show, which will provoke their questions and stuff for next time maybe. So we'll see how all that works.
Cool.
All right, so Romans chapter 15, that's where we're headed today. So, and remember how quickly I got set up? Yeah, I forgot something. I was like, you're right, that was really quick, man. I must be forgetting something. That's nothing major, though. It'll only take a second to fix. So, but we can go ahead and kick off if you want to, and just take it away, and I'll follow you along best again.
Okay, so Romans 15, we're nearing the end here. This chapter really it follows up on Romans 14, and it's largely really dealing with the importance Paul is going to be teaching, the importance of Christians from different backgrounds to just all get along nicely and play nicely together, and not hassle each other because they're different. It's a major theme of Romans 14 and Romans 15. He begins this week by going back to a theme that he brought up in Romans 14, which is he spoke about those who were strong in the faith and those who were weak in the faith. And we saw that the way most people seem to understand this is that he refers to those who felt that there is still a need to observe the dietary laws of the Torah and to observe the special times, Sabbaths and festivals of the Torah. He refers to them as weak because they feel that they have some need to do these things. And the strong in the faith, as far as Paul's concerned, are those who realize that they've basically been freed from these things. They don't really need them anymore. Their salvation is simply through having faith in Jesus, and there's basically the one of the major themes of Paul's writings is that you're no longer under the law. And although he doesn't seem to take any great hostility toward people who are observing the Torah, but he doesn't think it's necessary, and he seems to refer to people who have some great need to do it as weak, and they have some kind of a hang-up. Now it's interesting that in this, I never quoted this before, but there's a Catholic edition of the Bible called the St. Joseph edition of the Bible, and they have interesting study notes. So they say here that Paul never refused to allow Christians of Jewish origin to esteem attachment to their religious traditions. So he's saying here that Paul never refused to allow these people to maintain their religious traditions, but he has put clamps on the new freedom only when such freedom turns into provocative pretense and an attitude of superiority. And this is actually something that's reflected in many of the commentaries to Romans here. What I found peculiar, though, is if the bottom line is everyone should get along and you shouldn't feel superior, so what about calling some people strong and some people weak? That seems to me, at least, to be implying a superiority, right? The strong are okay, the weak, something's wrong with them. And, I think the big question is, what is this, how does this designating the different Christians as strong or weak, how does this foster the kind of unity that Paul is seeking in these chapters? So I thought this is just not getting off to a good start for Paul. And he goes on to say that, basically the strong have to make room for the weak. They have to tolerate them. They have to be supportive of them. And he goes on to say that in verse 2, let each of us please his neighbor for his good, meaning we should try to be, Paul says, supportive of others, even though they're weak and there's something wrong with them, leading to edification. And then he goes on in verse 3, for even the Messiah did not please himself, meaning that it's interesting. What does that mean? So the New American Standard Study Bible says that Jesus did not please himself. He came to do the will of his Father, not his own will. Now, when I read a comment like that, I wonder, how does this play into the idea of the Trinity? The idea that, the three persons of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are all co-equal. They're not really different at all. They're basically, they're of a unity, and that they're essentially of one substance, and that they're all basically the same. And to speak about, the Son, Jesus here, coming to do the will of his Father and not his own will, you would not imagine that between the Son and the Father to be different wills, if there's an equality between the three persons here. This is always a huge problem with people who advocate the idea of the Trinity, and they're forced to basically posit the idea that sometimes the Christian Bible speaks about Jesus in his humanity, and sometimes it refers to him with his divine nature. So it's a convenient thing to say, but it's a very difficult thing to maintain, and obviously they'd be forced to say that here. So in verse 3, they say that again, the whole point is that every one of the Christians should basically go beyond their own needs try to put themselves out for their neighbor, for their neighbor's good, because in verse 3, for even the Messiah did not please himself, but as it is written, and now Paul quotes, as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. The reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. Now, again, Paul is pulling a little bit of a fast one here, because he's quoting from the Hebrew Bible. Whenever the Greek Testament, whenever the Christian scriptures says as it is written, it's always quoting from the Hebrew Bible. And Paul's giving the impression here that this is a verse that is referring to Jesus. As a matter of fact, he would even give the impression that Jesus is speaking. And what is it that Jesus seems to be saying? In the verse that's quoted from the book of Psalms, chapter 69, verse 9, in a Hebrew Bible, in a Jewish Bible, it's 69, verse 10. So that the impression is that Jesus says, the reproaches of those who reproached you, meaning that there are those who basically were opposed to God, and their opposition really fell, Jesus says, on me. So again, this for Paul becomes the proof text that Jesus did not come to please himself. He took a bullet for the team, so to speak, and he suffered, basically because people hated God. They took it out on Jesus. Now, this is all peculiar because this verse is obviously not talking about Jesus. If you go to Psalm 69, in verse 1, it says this is by David. It's David is writing this about himself. Like almost all of the Psalms, David is speaking about his own life. In the Psalms that describe his suffering, he is describing his own suffering and tribulations. And one of the interesting things is that, if a Christian is going to kick and scream and insist that no, Psalm 69 is really speaking about Jesus, as many of the messianic commentaries that I saw, they cutely try to say, well, the pshat, the simple meaning of Psalm 69, is obviously speaking about David, but on a midrashic level, they say,
Right.
the remez, the hint, the midrash, is that it's speaking about Jesus, symbolically. But it's a very dangerous game to play, because if you study Psalm 69, just look at verse 6, where it says, "O God, you know my folly, and my guilty acts from you are not hidden." So would any Christian believe that this applies to Jesus?
Right.
That Jesus is saying that, that he commits folly and guilty acts? And they'd be forced to say, no, it doesn't. I'm only referring to, verse, 9 or verse 10. So it becomes a game where you really forget about the psalm itself. The psalm, just ignore those verses behind the curtain. We're not going to pay too much attention to, the psalm itself. We're going to basically extract a sound bite from the psalm that we can conveniently apply to Jesus. But to say that this psalm somehow is really speaking about Jesus is just absurd, because it doesn't fit, even on a symbolic level. And, we see this happens many, many times when the New Testament or Christians try to quote from the Hebrew Bible. They're forced to play this game where they have to selectively quote verses from a chapter but ignore other verses. For example, I think it's actually the only time where Jesus himself says that a verse in the Psalms, or even a verse in the Tanakh, refers to himself, is when he says that, I think it's Psalm 41, which says that my close friend who I trusted, he's lifted up his heel against me. And Jesus says that speaks about himself in the story about being betrayed by Judas Iscariot. So Jesus says that the betrayal by Judas was foretold in, I believe it's Psalm 41, verse 10. It may be one verse off in a Christian Bible. And, you can try to make the case that this verse where the person says that their close friend who they trusted lifted up his heel and betrayed them, but the very, very same psalm, about 5 verses earlier, says, "Heal me, O Lord, for I've sinned against you." So again, no Christian is going to accept the possibility that Jesus actually said that he sinned against God. And so they're forced to basically ignore parts of the psalm that don't fit in. And that's what has to happen here when Paul tries to appeal to Psalm 69. Now, he goes on in verse 4 to say, and I guess he's defending himself. Paul says here in verse 4, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning." Paul is saying that, why was I quoting this verse from the book of Psalm? So he says whatever was written before, meaning the Tanakh, meaning the Hebrew Bible, everything there is written for our learning, for us to learn from. And obviously we know that to a great extent Christianity tried to make the claim that it's entirely based upon the Hebrew Bible. Throughout the Greek scriptures, all of the authors try to tie in their claims to the Hebrew Bible. Throughout the Gospels, they'll try to quote verses, that Jesus fulfilled, and then throughout the letters of Paul and other, pastoral letters, they try to appeal to verses in the Tanakh to say that their theology is actually rooted in the Hebrew scriptures. So the question is, Paul is saying that for Christians, the Hebrew Bible is critical. It's very important. It's a source for everything they believe, and it's their instruction. What is it that Jews believe about the Christian Bible? How do we flip that around? And so I've heard it said many times that from a Jewish perspective, there are many new and wonderful things in the New Testament. The only problem is that whatever is new is not wonderful, and whatever is wonderful is not new. Meaning that, you have plenty of things in the Christian Bible that any Jew would recognize as being true because it corresponds with the revelation of God in the Tanakh. But those things in the Christian Bible that are new, meaning they contradict the Tanakh, we wouldn't call wonderful at all. We'd say they're highly problematic. In David Stern's commentary to Romans here, he complains that so many Christians basically ignore the Tanakh and don't study it. They focus almost everything on the Greek scriptures, on the New Testament. In many churches, the preaching is only from the New Testament. And what David Stern says, he wrote a very famous commentary to the New Testament from a messianic perspective. So he claims that by ignoring the Tanakh, these Christians are depriving themselves, he says, of the encouragement, comfort, and good counsel of the Tanakh. I would say that, maybe David Stern's sort of ignoring the fact that many Christians who do study the Tanakh come to realize that it's totally out of line with the New Testament, meaning that, you could easily say that the greatest danger to Christianity is the Tanakh. And, we both have seen so many people who, after studying the Tanakh, they have to walk away from Christianity. They walk away from the New Testament because you can't have both. These are documents that are mutually exclusive. And so, when Paul says here that all of the scriptures, obviously referring to the Tanakh, were given for our education and for us to learn from, I would agree. I would say, you know, I would encourage more and more Christians to learn the Tanakh more and more. And, you know, they'll see that it doesn't support their New Testament beliefs. I think also, we'll make one more point here, that in verse 5, I don't know if this kind of verse, and we'll see this in a few places in chapter 15, I don't know if this verse easily supports the doctrine of a Trinity. He says in verse 5, "Now may the God of patience and comfort grant you to be like-minded toward one another, according to the Messiah Jesus, that you may with one mind and one mouth glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus the Messiah." So again, he doesn't seem to be equating Jesus with God here, God the Father. You know, again, from a Trinitarian point of view, would equate basically the Jesus or the Son with the Father. They wouldn't be one subordinate to the other. They wouldn't be different from each other. You know, again, from the Trinitarian point of view, they're totally equal. And I think here it's hard to really take that perspective. It seems that Paul is differentiating here between God and the Messiah Jesus. And I think, again, I've pointed out that this is something which invariably we find in Paul's writings. If we go to verse, now what happened to verse 6 here? Okay, yeah, I think I just read verse 6. So in verse 7, we find the same thing.
Okay.
Paul says, "Therefore receive one another, just as Messiah has received us, to the glory of God." Again, the Messiah is not God, is different than God. And he goes on in verse 8 now. This is going to be interesting. He's going to quote, I think, 4 or 5 passages from the Tanakh here to support something. And we're going to see that this is really a failure. He says, "I say that the Messiah Jesus has become a servant to the circumcision," meaning a servant to the Jews, "for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." So now he's going to try to prove that really the advent of Jesus and the advent of Christianity was to basically open up the world of salvation for Gentiles so that they can become, and this is a critical piece here, that from Paul's point of view, and Paul has written this already a number of times earlier in Romans. You know, he spoke about the Jewish people being the olive tree that the Gentiles get grafted into through faith in Jesus. So he's going to try to prove here that, you know, that what Jesus anticipated and what was really prophesied before him in the Tanakh was that at some point the Gentiles would come into and become part of God's people, God's chosen people. So we're going to go through these passages now. So he says, again, back in verse 9, "For this reason I will confess to you," I'm sorry, I want to go back. In verse 9, yes, "and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." Now he quotes, "as it is written." Now he's quoting from Psalm 18, verse 49. I think in a Hebrew Bible it's 18, verse 50. And the same verse actually appears in 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 50 as well. And so what is the passage? It says in this verse in Psalms, "For this reason I will confess you among the Gentiles and sing to your name." Now what's going on in that verse? "For this reason I will confess you among the Gentiles and sing to your name." So if you go back to the beginning of Psalm 18, it says it's a psalm of David, meaning that this is a psalm that David is writing. And so David is speaking here, and David is the one that says, I will confess you among the Gentiles and sing to your name. So this is not a helpful proof text that Gentiles are going to be glorifying God. That again is what Paul is trying to do. Paul is trying to find passages in the Tanakh which speak about Gentiles who will glorify God, praise God, and they will come in to become part of God's people. So the first passage that Paul quotes here is not even about Gentiles praising God. It's about David praising God among the Gentiles. So strike one against Paul. Then in verse 10, and again he says, now who is he? When Paul says again, he says. So obviously this is not David, because this is going to be a verse from Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 43. So I didn't see this discussed in any of the commentaries to Romans, but I think that what Paul probably means is that he is referring to the source of revelation of, the book of Samuel, and the source of revelation ultimately of Psalms and in Deuteronomy. I mean, I think he's referring to God here, I suspect. So he tried quoting Psalms to prove his point. And again, he says now in verse 10, rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43. So this verse from Deuteronomy, here's a translation from a Hebrew Bible, Hebrew translation, Jewish translation. Sing praises, O nations, for his people. It's a verse which is saying that the nations of the world are going to be praising God's people. And what this really means is that this is really speaking about the future redemption, that in the future, and the Bible says this many, many times, that the nations of the world will come to recognize the greatness of Israel. They're going to come to recognize Israel's greatness during the future redemption. And that's what this verse in Deuteronomy 32 is saying, that the Gentiles will rejoice with his people, meaning for God's people. They're going to sing praises to God's people. And so, again, I would say this is not a helpful proof text to show that the Gentiles are going to be praising God, so to speak, although they will be praising God for the Jews. But it's not saying here in this verse that Gentiles are going to become God's people. It says they're going to be praising God's people, acknowledging God's people. So I would say here, strike two for Paul. The second proof text to me is very, very unconvincing. And again, he says in verse 11, now he's quoting from Psalm 117, verse 1. This is the shortest chapter in the Bible, just 2 verses. So Psalm 117, verse 1 says, praise the Lord, all you Gentiles. So here again, here you do have for the first time a verse which speaks about the Gentiles praising the Lord. Laud him, all of you peoples. But if you read the very next verse in this psalm, so it's Psalm 117, verse 2, it says, for his merciful kindness is great toward us. So, again, what's happening in this chapter of Psalms is that the Gentile world, this is obviously speaking about the future, the Gentile world, the nations, the peoples of the world are going to praise God because of God's great mercy and kindness toward Israel, meaning when Israel is going to be redeemed and they're going to see the glory of Israel in the Messianic age, they're going to come to praise God as well, the nations of the world. But again, there's nothing here in Psalm 117 that says that the Gentiles will become the people of God. They're not going to become Israel, so to speak. They're going to be praising God because of Israel, for Israel. So I would say here we have strike 3. Now, we're going to actually have a 4th strike. I don't know if there's another kind of New Testament baseball, but we have, after 3 strikes, Paul tries again now in verse 12. And again, he says, Isaiah says, now I'm going to read what Paul says. He says, Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he who shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, in him the Gentiles shall hope. Now, this is a bit of a disaster area because there is no such verse in Isaiah anywhere. You have in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10, it speaks about the root of Jesse. This is a famous and a very important messianic prophecy in Isaiah. But Isaiah 11 doesn't go on to say, he who shall rise to reign over the Gentiles. So this root of Jesse, it doesn't say in Isaiah chapter 11 he's going to reign over the Gentiles. And then the continuation of Paul, where it says, in him the Gentiles shall hope. So that seems to be referring not to Isaiah chapter 11, but it's sort of a little bit similar to Isaiah chapter 42, verse 4. Now, it says there in Isaiah 42, verse 4, and far-flung nations will be eager for his teachings. So Paul has it that in him the Gentiles will hope. It's not quite what it says in Isaiah. It says that the far-flung nations, which are the Gentiles, will be eager for his teachings, so that they're going to be receptive to the teachings of God, the teachings of the Torah. And if you want to say that Isaiah 42, if you insist it's a messianic prophecy, so the Messiah there will be the teacher of God's teachings, the person who will be exposing the world to God's teachings, as we see in the book of Isaiah. Out of Zion will go forth the Torah. Ki mitzion teitzei Torah in Isaiah chapter 2. So here we have Paul quoting apparently from Isaiah, but there is no such quote. And again, even if there was such a verse in Isaiah, it doesn't say that the Gentiles will become part of Israel. It doesn't say that the Gentiles will become part of God's people. It simply says they will learn from the Torah. They will learn from God's people. I just say one more thing here.
Okay.
That, from the Christological point of view, how do we say that God is glorified when, in a Christian scheme of things, the Gentiles are really praising and worshiping Jesus as God? And so in their scheme of things, it's hard to understand how God is really glorified if what the Gentile world believes in from a Christian point of view is that Jesus is God, when he certainly isn't. So that would be a hard stretch to say that God is being glorified there. So moving over to verse 14, excuse me.
Sure.
So we have here something interesting. Several commentaries point out, I'm going to actually read one of them. I saw this in the NLT Study Bible and in the Zondervan Study Bible. They say the following: from verse 14 here in Romans chapter 15 until the end of the book, until the end of Paul's letters to the Romans, from here to the very end, it says this final section contains elements common at the end of New Testament letters. So apparently what we're going to be coming up against now from here until the end of Romans is common in a number of letters in the New Testament. And it lists several common elements. Number one, a discussion of travel plans. We're going to see that Paul says, I'm planning to go to Spain and I must go to Jerusalem. So he's going to be sharing some of his travel plans. He's going to have requests for prayer. He's going to ask the Christians in Rome to pray for him. There are references to ministry associates, and there are greetings. And so these commentaries say that what we're going to encounter from here until the end of Romans is really common in many letters of the New Testament. As books come to a conclusion, the writer of those letters shares their travel plans and requests for prayer, etc. I'm going to ask a question, a rhetorical question. I'd say, to me, this sounds like Paul is writing a letter from himself to the Romans. And what it doesn't sound like is divine revelation. I've pointed out in the past that God really never speaks in the Christian Bible. You never find, thus says the Lord. You never really see God being quoted. And, even though I guess evangelical Christians believe that every word of the New Testament was revealed by God, they don't believe that these are just human documents. I ask the question when I read this, what does it sound like, though? And to me, it sounds like, Paul is writing a letter from himself to the church in Rome, to the churches in Rome, and he's sharing with them, look, I plan on going to Spain, and I have to go to Jerusalem, so please pray for me, etc. This doesn't sound to me like something that is divine revelation. To me, it really rings like Paul's writing a letter, his own letter coming from himself. And the commentaries here point out that this is something actually that happens in many of the letters, the pastoral letters, and the epistles of the New Testament. So I don't see this as a plus for the side that insists that every single word here was revealed divinely, for divine revelation. I think that what happens is that this is simply accepted by the church as divinely revealed. It's just an axiom, but I don't really see any proof whatsoever. So that's just a point I wanted to make. Now, what happens here at the very end of verse 20 and 21, Paul says, and so I've made it my aim to preach the gospel, not where Jesus or where the Messiah was named. So he's saying that I didn't do a lot of preaching where Jesus was well known, lest I should build on another person's foundation. I didn't want to to really duplicate efforts. He's saying I wanted to go where no man has gone before. And he says, lest I should build on another man's foundation, but as it is written. Now again, Paul pulls a verse from the Hebrew scriptures out of his back pocket, and he says, as it is written, to whom he was not announced they shall see, and those who have not heard shall understand. Now, that's cute. I mean, he just finished saying that, he didn't go around preaching to places where they had heard of the gospel message already. He went to places where they didn't hear yet, right? He didn't want to to go where other people had a ministry and other people were preaching. And he seems to be trying to say now that this idea of his was anticipated somehow in the Hebrew Bible. In the HCSB Study Bible, they write that Paul felt that his ministry was in keeping with Old Testament messianic prophecy. And he's quoting here from Isaiah chapter 52, verse 15. In the Zondervan Study Bible, it says Paul applies language from Isaiah's servant to himself elsewhere as well. For example, when we get to Galatians, so Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, Paul seems to try to apply language from Isaiah about God's servant to himself. So Paul seems to, it's very interesting. I've mentioned before that according to Professor James Tabor, Paul came to see himself almost as a second Jesus, as another Jesus. And so whereas the Christian scriptures are always trying to make the claim that the Hebrew scriptures spoke about Jesus, and they certainly liberally applied the passages in Isaiah about the servant of the Lord to Jesus, Paul here takes those verses and applies them to himself, which is very strange. So here he's quoting from the end of chapter 52. Now, anyone that's familiar with the famous chapter of the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 53, so they know that that passage really begins with the last three verses in chapter 52. And so Paul now is quoting from that very passage where it says, I'll quote from a Jewish translation, "For they beheld that which was not told to them, and they understood that which they had not heard." Now, again, Paul is saying that this supports his plan of preaching to places that had not yet heard about Jesus. He was going to be going to virgin territory, to new territory. Now, what's actually going on at the end of chapter 52 there? So this is actually a fascinating three verses at the end of chapter 52, because Paul basically, Isaiah basically says, I'm going to be paraphrasing, that the servant of the Lord is going to, Isaiah says, prosper, be elevated, exalted, and lifted very high. That's what Isaiah says about the servant of the Lord. Behold, my servant will prosper, will succeed, will be elevated, and raised very high. That's what Isaiah says about the servant of the Lord. Now, Isaiah goes on to say that when this happens, when God's servant is elevated and lifted up very high and it is successful, what Isaiah says, it's going to totally shock and surprise the nations and kings of the world. He says that they're going to put their hands over their mouths, and they're totally blown away, totally shocked when the servant is elevated and lifted up and raised very high. And then he goes on to say, because that which they had not been told, they will see, and that which they had not heard, they will understand. Meaning that the elevation and the success of the servant is something that the nations and the kings of the world never expected, and that's why it came as such a shock. It will come as such a shock to them. Now, what's fascinating is, the $64,000 question is, who is this speaking about? Who is this servant of the Lord? So Christianity insists that it's referring to Jesus. And traditional Jewish understanding is that no, if you read the book of Isaiah, it consistently identifies the servant of God as Israel, or as the righteous among Israel, those who are servants of the Lord. But Isaiah repeatedly identifies God's servant with Israel in the preceding chapters. But this has become a significant debate between the Christian and Jewish interpretation of Isaiah. But I think that if we're to just read these last verses in chapter 52, it becomes quite obvious that there's really no way of defending the Christian interpretation. So let's go back for a moment. God says about his servant, whoever it is, let's keep it as a question mark. Behold, my servant will be lifted up, raised very high, and prosper. So what God is predicting through the prophet Isaiah is that one day in the future, the servant is going to be successful, lifted up very high, and elevated. Now, let's go to the Christian point of view, and they insist that this servant is Jesus. So the problem is that Isaiah says that when this happens to the servant, it's going to totally shock and surprise and blow the minds of the nations and kings of the world. Now that makes absolutely no sense, because from the time of the advent, the beginnings of Christianity, Christians have been expecting that Jesus is going to return, and when that happens, he will be acknowledged by the entire world. And since that time, Christianity has grown to the largest religion in the world. There are now 2.2 billion Christians in the world. And the second largest religion in the world is Islam, with about 1.5 or 1.7 billion people. And they also believe in Jesus, and they believe Jesus is coming back. And so you have the majority of the world that not only believe in Jesus, they expect him to triumphantly return in the future. So if that's the case, and if Isaiah here is speaking about Jesus, why would that shock the whole world? Why would his return blow the minds of the nations and kings of the world, when that's exactly what the nations and kings of the world are expecting? They're expecting Jesus to return triumphantly, to be elevated, lifted up, raised very high. And they expect that even the Jews are coming to acknowledge that. Now, if Isaiah was really speaking here about Jesus, the only people on the planet that would be shocked if he were the one to be elevated, lifted up, and raised very high would be the Jews. The Jews would be shocked by that. And yet, at the end of chapter 52, Isaiah does not say that when this servant of God is going to be raised up and lifted very high, it's going to totally blow the minds and shock the Jewish people.
Right.
It says it's going to shock and blow the minds of the nations of the world. So their reading of this, that it's referring to Jesus, makes no sense. However, the Jewish interpretation is that the servant is Israel. And now it makes perfect sense, because it's saying, behold, my servant will be lifted up and raised very high and be successful. And that's Israel. And by the way, when is Israel going to be lifted up and raised very high? It's going to be at the coming of the Messiah. And it's speaking about a Messiah that's not Jesus. And so the Messiah is going to come, and Israel is going to be acknowledged by the entire world. They're going to be elevated and lifted up and raised very high. But it's going to come as a total shock to the entire world, because it's not what they were expecting. And that's what Isaiah says here. Because they will behold that which was not told to them, and they will understand that which they had not heard. Meaning, this elevation of Israel is something that will shock the world, because they totally didn't expect it. And so this is normally used as a proof text for Jesus, which totally doesn't work. But Paul is trying to use it here as a proof text for himself, which, I believe is doubly, problematic. And my good friend William, that's all she wrote for tonight.
That's all. That was a lot. That was, man, I tell you what, putting Paul on the spot, I think if he was here right now, you would have him squirming in his moccasins.
I don't want to do that to Paul.
Right.
I would like him to breathe and to have serenity. I don't want him to squirm. I would like him to just simply come to realize that he
Right.
was mistaken.
Right.
Just no need to make him squirm.
Right.
Just, we're hoping that Paul, if he was here with us,
Maybe he would
that
say,
he
you got a good point.
he would come to his senses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That would be nice for sure. Well, Rabbi, it's been a very good and full evening, and thank you again. And all you viewers out there, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and turn on the notifications. Same if you go to Rabbi Skovac's YouTube channel. Be sure to turn on the notifications bell. If you don't, you will not know when the recordings are actually taking place. So to all of you guys, I say have a great week. Shavua Tov to you, sweet Rebbe, and we will see you again, Hashem willing, same time, same place next week.
And a really, really happy Purim to everyone.
Yes, a very okay.
was
Not
almost gonna
too
come
happy.
tonight.
I heard about some of these Purim parties.
I was actually going to come tonight wearing a Purim costume, but I decided, nah, it's too early.
So are you going to do it next week then, after the Purim? Just for
No.
Yeah.
1 year when we do this program on Purim, right? Then maybe you'll see me with a crazy outfit.
That's great.
I remember once seeing Rabbi Kaufman on your show.
Yeah, he was definitely having fun that night. There's no doubt about that. Oh man, that's great. All right, well, Shavua Tov, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for tuning in. And we'll see you next time. Shalom, shalom. Take care.
תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים, זה טבעם של אנשים שונים. נזכור בסוף
Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingston, Texas, USA, with the interesting show that you're going to want to watch. Episode 1. Technically, maybe we will have episode 2. Is Torah for the non-Jew? The proper method of study. Coming to you from my dear holy brother, Rod Bryant. Where did my screen go? I think I lost the screen here. Hang on just a second. See, no matter how much... Hey, you get to look at your handsome face, though. Oh man, I even double triple checked everything and it still doesn't always end up the way it should. So good song though. Rod, it's good to have you back in the studio. Seems like it's been forever.
It has been. It's been a whole 5 minutes.
It has been. Actually, this is an easy fix. I had to do an edit shot on one of my shots, and I wiped you off of the screen, and I need to figure out. I need to put you back on the screen, and there it is, right there. There we go. We got it now.
Every minute that I'm not on screen is probably the best.
Oh, never, not at all. Okay, so cool. This is going to be an interesting little informative talk. I'm sure I'll ask you questions that may even come across annoying. I don't know. I'll try not to. But
No. And look, if anybody has questions they want to ask,
certainly
put on the chat or whatever. That's fine with me.
Actually, that's a good idea. I should do that as well because that's a very handy tool. How much time do you have left before you have to jet out of here?
Look, I've got time.
Okay,
we're okay.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to open the phone lines. The phone lines are open, and so and definitely, as usual, specifically intentional only for the topic of today's show.
Right.
So please keep that in mind. And
I wouldn't have the data on whether Adam and Eve have navels. Okay, so
right on. That's funny. Okay, so let me see, Tyler Live, and where's it at? I've got so many ads up here, it's hard to find them these days. 855-95-BIBLE. Just remember that. And no, this is not MetaShare. You know, it's funny. MetaShare, apparently, their phone number is very close to mine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but what's funny is people call it all the time. And probably, I don't know, I get at least 10 messages a day from people who are wanting insurance. And I'm thinking, I did leave a voicemail saying this is Tanakh Talk.
It doesn't matter.
And it's like maybe they're thinking, well, maybe if
So what you should do is start calling these people back and cranking them. Like set them up and tell them, ask them for their medical data. And
oh my, that's funny. That's
that'd
funny.
be terrible.
That would be very horrible. Shame on us for enjoying that thought.
Yeah.
So, okay, good deal. Okay, so I'll let you kick this thing off, and while you're discussing this and kind of going through this, I'm going to edit a screen, so I might be a little bit distracted for a minute or two, but then I'll be right back with you.
No,
I'll be on screen with you, though. So go ahead and tell us a little bit, kind of give us an overall summary. Tell us what you're going to tell us.
Let's make this concise and, as one news presenter says, pithy. I would like to just open up with this question. What is the Torah for the non-Jew? And the reason why I ask this is I get this asked most often by rabbis or Orthodox rabbis who are interested in the non-Jewish world, the righteous non-Jewish world, B'nai Noach, and their study of Torah. And most of the time, obviously they'll say, well, they should know the Sheva Mitzvot. They should learn what those are. They should concentrate on those first. I had one rabbi ask and say, well, shouldn't they just concentrate on only studying the Sheva Mitzvot in the Tanakh or in the Torah? And then one said maybe they should only study just the Torah for the non-Jew. And I had to remind them there's no such thing. There is no such thing as a non-Jewish Torah. The Torah was given
specifically
to the Jewish
for
people.
the Jew. To the Jew, right?
Yeah,
I got
for the Jewish people, to the Jewish people. Now, we don't want to make it sound as if the Torah has no application for the non-Jewish world. So I want you to just take that out of the equation right off the bat. So let me paint a picture. If you go back to the three or four portions, parashiots, prior to Tetzaveh, where we're at now, and we have Parshat Yitro. Now, none of these are in chronological order, but we're going to see a pattern that's being established by the Holy One, blessed be He. And that pattern is this. Yitro comes on the scene, and Moshe is, going out of his mind trying to take care of all of these people. And he sits hours from daylight to dark, instructing them and judging on matters. And Yitro says, this is no way to govern people. You have people around here that have great wisdom that can do this. Set them up, teach them. You have set up judges, and you can do this. So we see this sort of judiciary side of Judaism, the base din, say, of Judaism being established right off the bat. But then we have Meshpatim that comes up right after that. And if you carefully go through Meshpatim, you're going to discover something very surprising. The Sheva Mitzvot are laid out in Meshpatim. Did you know that, Will?
I've heard roughly about it, but I don't know the details.
The Sheva Mitzvot are laid out. And it's interesting because Moses was told to tell the people. He didn't say tell the sons of Judah, or he didn't say the sons of Israel. He says the people. Now, what's the distinction? When he says the people, he means everybody, to include the Ger Tzaddik, or the Ger Toshav that was there, as well as the Israelites. Okay. So with that being said, he lays out the Sheva Mitzvot, not to eat the lamb ripped from an animal, not to drink blood, not to worship idols. He talks extensively about justice. What is justice? For example, if you don't like your neighbor, you hate his guts, but you see his donkey is in a hole somewhere, you still have the responsibility to help him dislodge that animal, because it's very important. Or if you have an ox that gourds another ox and you're aware of the problem, you've been warned, then there are judgments and penalties. So very extensively we're given what justice looks like for the people of God, not only Israel, but the nations. It goes through Mishpatim. Mishpatim wraps up with the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, and circumcision. Now, one would say, well, what does the red heifer have to do with a person in the nations? It has nothing to do with it. It's all about the Mishkan. Well, my Jewish friends and my non-Jewish friends, remember that without the red heifer, we wouldn't have a Mishkan, because we can't dedicate the Mishkan without a red heifer. That's number one. Number two, Israel was given a Mishkan so that the dwelling place of Hashem, the Shekinah of God, could be realized and understood, that an intimate relationship that Israel could see with their own physical eyes. It wasn't that they didn't already have that. They needed to see it. And that's what the tabernacle was for. But in the end, the tabernacle is declared the house of prayer for all people. The reason why there's a red heifer is because we needed a Mishkan. Why do we need the Mishkan? So that the kings and priests of Israel can be a light to the nations, and so the nations would come in the end time for redemption to the temple, to be able to bring sacrifices and offering. So the whole point is this: is there a Torah for the non-Jew? No. But is the Torah for the non-Jew? Yes.
Nicely put.
Do you understand the difference?
Yeah, perfect.
And so if the Torah is for the non-Jew, then the question is, what part of the Torah is for the non-Jew?
Right.
So I like to use, as Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi says, you like to use this metaphorical idea, right? This metaphorical idea.
And that is
this. I live in the great state of Texas, next to the Holy Land, the best place to live. You live there too.
Yes.
And this great state we have what we call the Texas Penal Code. And it's a book about 3 inches thick with all of the codes or laws in the state of Texas, from automotive to drug sales to pharmaceutical regulations, you name it, it's all in there. Now, as a non-pharmaceutical citizen of the state of Texas, do I have to abide by the non-pharmaceutical rules? No, they don't even apply to me. However, if I were to open up a pharmaceutical sales out of the trunk of my car in my neighborhood from drugs that I purchased from my doctor, then those pharmaceutical laws almost all of a sudden will be applied to me, because I will be illegally selling pharmaceuticals.
Bingo.
Therefore, right, I will be judged based on those laws. Okay? Now, when I say that the reason why that the non-Jew has to study all of the Torah, to include, when I say Torah, I'm assuming that everybody knows I mean oral and written. You can't divide the two. So when I say study the Torah, I mean both. The reason why that both need to be studied is for this purpose. How do we know what courts of justice are if we don't see all of the Torah law that deals with how man relates to man? If I don't see how my fellow Jew relates to another fellow Jew based on Torah law, then how do I know how I'm supposed to act, right?
Agreed.
So if I'm supposed to find out what is it, how do I know what justice means? For example, if I create damages to another human being, then I have to know all of the Torah to know that. I have to hear the oral discussions between the great Chachamim of our time that wrestled between what needed to be done to rectify certain situations. That's how I know. And the reason why that I need to know all the Torah is, even though it doesn't apply to me, and I would even go this far, the rabbinical law that has been established by the rabbis over the centuries, also I need to know. Do you know why? Not for the purpose that I need to know about turning light switches on and off. It has nothing to do with me whether I wear my strimal a certain way. It has nothing to do with me. It's the very fact that I begin to understand the logic of Torah law. That's number one. Number two, I begin to understand what my place is in the Torah world, in the world of the Jew. And we have, for example, opportunity in this community to sit at Shabbos tables with Orthodox Jewish people, and the non-Jew needs to know, what does rabbinical Judaism and what does the Talmud say about a non-Jew that sits at the table of a Jew? And how are they to conduct themselves? Therefore, the Torah law pertaining to Jews at the Shabbos table applies to me. Even though I am not bound to do the things they are due, I'm most definitely bound to do the things I'm not supposed to do. Correct?
Right.
So therefore, I need to know. And this is the big thing. I hear this often from the rabbis who are challenged by people from the non-Jewish world. The B'nai Noach, the Ger, comes into their place of worship for the first time, and they go, well, it's uncomfortable to have them here. And the reason why it's uncomfortable is, honestly, I don't want to say anything that's going to offend them. I don't want to hurt their feelings. And I explained to them this, that a righteous non-Jew who has taken the great effort and undergone the greatest of separation and persecution to leave their former life, including family members who have rejected them, society has rejected them, to enjoin themselves with the people of God. When they come in, they are Torah keepers. They are Torah keepers according to the traditions that are set out for the non-Jew. And if you don't tell them what their place is and what their responsibility, you're not giving them the Torah they need to live.
Right. Yeah.
They're not going to be offended when they find out, well, we're part of the synagogue community, but my children can't marry Jewish children. Because we're Torah keepers, that's what we do. That's our job. Just like it is your job as a Jew to only marry a Jew,
right,
then it is my job to only marry a righteous non-Jew.
Right.
I wouldn't want my children marrying somebody who's Avodah Zarah.
Right.
Is that racist all of a sudden that I say that I don't want my children to marry an idol worshiper? Of course not. Mm-hmm. So the point is we have to know those things. And so, for example, when and I explained this to rabbis, when a non-Jewish person comes into the community, they need to learn what's appropriate and inappropriate. And they're not going to be offended. Why? Because for the first time, they're going to feel like they're part of the family when they know the rules.
Right.
And I'm going to use an illustration.
Go for it.
I remember going over to a friend of mine's house, and he and his brothers, they had a great relationship with their father. I mean, it was fantastic. But all the time that I went over there, I was always a visitor. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I was never part of their household. I was a visitor. But I remember that one time when he came in and fussed at all of us, including me.
That's a good example.
Right? I mean, I came short of having my back end lit up by him.
That's funny.
When it was all over, I was like, dang, I feel like I'm part of the crew now.
Right.
Right? So the whole point is I am saying to the non-Jewish world that I'm saying to the Jewish world, the Orthodox Jewish world, your non-Jewish associates that are the B'nai Noach, who are Torah-loving, God-fearing people, they want to know what the Torah says. Even the Torah that doesn't apply to them. Why? Because they want to make sure they do it right. And they're not going to be offended by you telling them the truth, because they're much further than that. If truth was going to offend them, they would have never left Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever.
Sure.
Right?
Even if
so they want to know.
Even if they do find offense to it, I mean, their sound ability to find logic will help them level back out again.
Right. And I would let's add this to the non-Jewish world. if you are offended by things that you're told, and you're automatically take it personally, and you don't look at it introspectively, then something is wrong with your midot, your character. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Something's wrong with your character, and I'm not trying to talk down to you. I'm just saying, if you rub the cat the wrong way, just turn the cat around. I'm just saying all you have to do is change your life. Figure out, okay, why was I offended by that? Is what this person's saying true? And if it's true, then that's what I'm going for. I want to be a lover of truth. Now, with that all been said, let's go into the proper method of studying Torah.
Good.
In the world that you and I come from, the study of Scripture was bound to this: spending hours reading it and coming up with things that were part of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost. Correct?
Right.
Okay, and it was totally just whatever the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit inspired you, harebrained, occultish things, and justify it by quoting passages from Scripture. The reason why we don't have this in Judaism is not because we do not operate by the wisdom of God, but we operate from the wisdom of the Torah and the wisdom of the oral Torah as well to interpret Scripture. Often in our classes, someone will say, hey, this is an observation I have, and they give the observation. And then I'll say, well, what is your source for that? And they'll go, well, I don't really have a source, but it's an observation. I said, well, I appreciate that. It's a good observation, but let's kind of put it on the shelf until we can find a source that'll back that up. Why do I say that? Because whether we like it or not, the non-Jewish world likes it or not, God didn't choose the non-Jewish world to preserve the Torah.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Right. Agreed.
If you have a problem with that, then the problem is between you and the creator of the universe. And brother, I don't think you have enough chutzpah to face that.
Right.
Right. So the best thing to do is say, that's what God chose. Good, bad, or indifferent, whether it was perfect. Look, we understand that a small percentage of Jews are Orthodox. And even a smaller percentage of them are ones that you would say are like the best of the best. Right? Mm-hmm. But they were given the responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's not for us to quibble as to why didn't he give it to us? And for the Christian world to say that we are the new Israel and God gave it to us because they messed it up, that is a fantasy land, folks. And if you are a Christian listening to this, I know it. I've been there. I bought the ticket. I had the video series for 35 years. I slept under the pews. I was a pro.
You stood behind the pulpit.
And I stood behind the pulpit and pastored a large non-denominational church in Kingwood, Texas. So I'm just telling you, I know what I'm talking about when I say that the Christian world was not given the responsibility to preserve the Torah. So right on. If that being the case, then my only source for anything that I know about the Scripture, or the Tanakh, has to come from Jewish sources. And I know, William, as I'm saying this, there are people whose heads are spinning around and they're like throwing up pea soup right now because they don't want to hear that.
Right.
But the facts are the facts. If I wanted to know what was the meaning of the Second Amendment of the Constitution, I cannot get it by going down and reading it in the what do you call it, where it's at in the Smithsonian. Read that line and say, well, I think it means this. Frankly, there's not a court in this nation that cares about what you think about that text.
Right. They know what it means, and it's all that matters.
Right. And how do they know what it means? Is if you look behind a judge's chamber, you'll see volumes of books. And in each one of those books are case after case of rulings that have come down that have determined what that law means based on the interpretation and how it's acted out. Okay? Now, we do this in this country all day long, and no one bats an eye. They go, hey, well, that's just the law. It's how it works. But how in the world can you say that about the very law of the creator of the universe? He gave the Torah to the Jewish people. He gave the Sanhedrin the responsibility, like the Supreme Court, to bring down rulings. And those rulings apply to the Jewish people as some rulings for the non-Jewish world. But the point is, they determine. If you really want to know God, know his Torah. If you really want to know the Torah, then you have to study the Torah based on the sages, based on the oral Torah. Torah interprets Torah.
Right on, right on. Couldn't have said it any better. And what's really interesting too is, right now, our world has. See, I got it. Let me check this message real fast. See. Yeah, show. I just had a YouTube flag comment. I just went ahead and approved it. It's like right now we're going. This whole world is going through an uprising, thanks to social media. You've got Christians like leaving in droves.
Right.
That's just recently been happening in such high volumes, and probably thanks to the internet and thanks to the availability of information and knowledge. And we're going through that stage right now where there's a lot of shock going on about the Noahide, and I'm not a Noahide, then I'm better than that, or whatever. There's the Ger, all these terms, and there's so many nervous people out there. But the thing is, 100 years from now, of course, may Mashiach come soon, but 100 years from now, whenever we've gone through all this information and all this excitement, and there's been proper teachings have gone on, and all of a sudden these families are starting to become comfortable with who they are in Hashem, then they'll be able to start teaching their kids that comfort. Right now, no one knows the comfort. Right now, they only know the shock. But in the next generation, they'll know the comfort. In the generation after that, they will be comfortable. And before you know it, it's not going to be a shock to them that they're not the ones who are supposed to be preserving Torah. They're going to know it. It's what I told my daughter. That's funny. She would be laughing right now if she was here. My daughter is 14, and ever since she was like old enough to talk, or old enough to carry on conversations like what I'm going to bring up, this is what we talk about. And so it would be, today she's 14 and she fully expects me to pick out her husband, and she's perfectly cool with that. Now, you go to another family who's never even mentioned that idea to their daughter. She's going to be like, excuse me, I don't think so.
Yeah, you would be considered a cult leader.
Totally. And see, but my daughter knows me, and I've talked with her enough about all those books on the back shelf explaining everything. She's experienced that her whole life, so she knows all the context of what that means. And not only does it not bother her, she really appreciates that I'm willing to do that for her, because she understands it, because we've taught her the details and what that means and the implications and all this other stuff and all the freedoms and the whole picture. So 100 years from now, I think that's what we're going to start experiencing. We're going to look back or look forward, whatever, and see that this generation was the tough one. This was the one.
Oh, this most definitely is going to be the hard one, and God willing, with the advent of Mashiach coming to sort of rectify everything and set it straight and say this is the way it is, we're going to have to struggle. But what's beautiful is, Will, you and I we're like on the tip of the spear of seeing redemption played out in the world. And it's odd and it's unusual and it's clunky, but we're trying to navigate this properly. And I realize that we're going to be, it would be easy to be beset by arguments and disputations of people. You have that, the Noahide, the Ger, who's the Ger Toshav, now, all those things. Look, that argument, I guess, has to take place.
It will.
But one of the things that I say all the time to these people is I'm more interested in serving Hashem than I am about disputation. If you guys want to argue about this stuff, that's great. But I'm too busy serving Hashem and doing the right thing and teaching Torah to be worried about those things. When you guys get it figured out, get back with me. In the meantime, I'm going to keep my eyes focused straight.
Indeed. I'm excited, about all of this. And it wasn't until recently that I have. I mean, like we discussed earlier too. The whole idea of the Ger Toshav and the righteous Gentile, the Ger Tzaddik and all these other things. That was not something of huge concern back whenever I mean, the Ger Toshav, yes, the non-Jew living in the Holy Land, that was about the only thing that they had to write about back when the
Right.
when the oral law was there, and so it's really new territory even for the rabbis, and so
Right.
And they're having to take all this context from from several thousand years ago and try to come up with right ruling, and so be patient with them whenever
Right.
you talk to your rabbi. If they say something that might seem odd, just take a deep breath and just, I mean,
Right.
we're not the teachers. We're trying to learn this ourselves. So
Right.
yeah.
Don't be easily offended,
Yeah, right.
and be humble, and be a good student that's willing to learn. And look, I've heard some stuff too over the time that it kind of sets with you wrong, but this is a journey, and as much as I would like to see it while I'm alive, I'm going to tell you it's coming. Whether we like it or not, even the Orthodox Jewish rabbinical world that might feel a little, put out by the whole idea, it's coming whether they like it or not.
Right, right.
It's coming whether the Christian world likes it or not. When Mashiach comes, he's going to say, this is how it's going to be. And those who are the righteous of the nation will be considered part of the covenant redemption that takes place. They'll have their place.
Agreed. Well, any closing words for our beloved watchers and
Well,
friends
I
out
would
there?
say to all of my seeker friends, stay true to yourself. Be authentic. Don't try to be somebody else. Don't be Jewish. Be Jewish. Be yourself. Love God. Love the Torah. And most of all, love truth above emotions and feelings.
You couldn't have put it any better, my sweet brother. Thank you for your time. I have a feeling I kind of said this was like a show, but it may actually be a mini-series for all we know. Because I know,
let's keep it up, man.
yeah, and so I think it'd be a good thing to kind of go in, because I think there's so much to cover on teaching us non-Jews how to worship, how to study, how to pray, in the best way we know how, based on what we have to learn from. So I think this may just be an introductory, so to speak. Somebody says, no, don't go. Sorry, guys. We've got Brother Rod has got some more teachings he's got to get on, too. And likewise, I got a show coming up here in about 2 hours. And I've been behind a computer for about 6 hours. I don't know. I lost track of time. Anyway, Rod, it's a pleasure as usual, brother. And we will see you on the other side. Shavua Tov, everybody. Shavua Tov.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים, זה טבעם של אנשים שונים. נזכור בסוף כולנו שותפים, חשוב תמיד להיות אנושיים. חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים, אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד. חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה
Love production, baby. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingston, Texas, USA, with episode number 54 or something like that of TNT, Twisted New Testament, with Rabbi Stuart Federer from Houston, Texas. That awesome dude. Welcome back, Rabbi. Gonna let the music play for a second so you get the finger dance in. Come on. There it is. That's what we were waiting for. All right. Very, very good, man. How are you doing, Rabbi?
Thank God, plugging away as usual.
Right on. You must continue.
Wait, what did you say about my right arm?
Did I?
You said right arm.
Right on. Okay, I'm going to switch glasses, get the glare down a little bit. Look through a little scratch, but it's okay. I can still see all right. Awesome. Well, cool. It's good to see everybody. Cincy, is that my reading it right? Litigator. Eddie Ramirez, Kelsey Lynn, good to see you. Grant Dunn, Delane. Pleasure seeing all you guys there. Okay, so the first topic we're going to kick off this thing with is, as you will know, notice about one aspect of it is, and also, as we're talking about this topic for the show, feel free on the comments to help give us some more clarity, because there's some things that I'm really gray on, some areas Rabbi might be, but one thing I noticed about all the
well, and
viewers,
I'm especially gray in my hair, so
nah, I'm catching up with you, man. More and more, I really contemplated just for one time, just to see what I look like young again, is to just dye all my facial hair and all my hair, just to see how many years it takes off. But I don't know. I'm just going to let it go. I don't really care. Gray or white, silver, whatever. Who cares?
Right.
So
yes, there's always boot black you can blacken.
That's funny. You hear something really crazy one time? We had when I was a kid, we had our little Halloween party or whatever at the school when I was like in elementary school, and my stepdad thought it would be cool to dress me up like what was that show with oh my gosh, John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John, Grease.
Grease.
Yeah, so a white T-shirt rolled up, had a cigarette pouch rolled up in my sleeve, the whole deal. But for my hair, he used to have Brill cream, but he didn't have any. He was out, so he used lard, and he put
God,
totally lard in my hair, slicked it back, and it was fine, but it was hot. And we went outside to play, dude. It felt like